The first time I died, I had an argument ready and no one to make it to. I'd spent my whole life believing the thing they teach you in debate, that if you can just build the case, lay out the facts, anticipate the rebuttal, speak it clean and true and unanswerable, you can win anything, change any mind, talk your way out of any corner the world backs you into. It was the one faith I had. And then I lay dying at 45 of a thing that money would have fixed, in a body I'd never been able to afford to save, watching the ceiling of a room I could barely pay for, and I built the case the way I always had, the clean, devastating, unanswerable argument for why a person like me should not have to die of a thing the rich survive without noticing. I built it perfectly. It was the best argument of my life. And there was no one to make it to. No judge. No panel. No one who decides these things hears a voice like mine, because the rooms where they decide who lives and who doesn't don't take arguments from the poor. The best arguer in any room I ever stood in, dying with the best argument of her life unspoken, because the one time it actually mattered, there was no room that would let me in to make it. Here is the cruelty of it, the thing I carried out of that room and across into a second life. I had a gift. Not a kid who was good at talking, I mean the real thing, the rare and dangerous thing. I could argue. I could take a case, any case, and build it so clean and tight and true that watching me do it felt like watching someone pick a lock you'd been told couldn't be picked. I heard the weakness in your position before you'd finished stating it. I saw 3 moves ahead to the rebuttal you didn't know you'd need. I could stand up with nothing but my voice and dismantle a better funded, better coached, better connected opponent and leave the wreckage of their case on the floor between us. And I loved it for a reason that a poor kid understands in her bones and a rich one never has to, because debate was the one room in the entire world where my voice counted exactly as much as anyone's. The judge didn't care that my suit came from a thrift store and the boy across from me wore one cut to fit him. The ballot didn't know my mother cleaned houses or that I'd never been to one of the expensive summer camps where the rich kids learned this game. The argument was the argument, true or false, strong or weak, and either I'd outbuilt you or I hadn't, and I almost always had, because the better argument doesn't care whose son you are. That brutal, beautiful fairness was the most precious thing I'd ever found, the one arena where being poor wasn't a sentence, where my voice was a weapon that cut through money like it wasn't there. And I gave it away. I spent the back half of my first life voiceless and powerless, ground down by a world I could have argued my way out of, dying of poverty in a room where no argument could reach, because a powerful man I trusted like a father looked me in the eye and told me to lose on purpose, to sit down and stay silent in the one fight that would have gotten me out, so that his real son could take my place. And then I opened my eyes, and the argument wasn't trapped behind a voiceless, dying body. It was real. My case notes spread on the desk in front of me in my own handwriting, and I was 17, my whole mind alive and arguing, the morning of the final. Let me tell you who I was, because you can't understand the size of what I gave away unless you understand what it is to be a poor kid with a powerful voice and no power at all. I grew up with nothing. A mother who cleaned other people's houses, a father long gone, a childhood of the particular grinding arithmetic of poverty, where everyone is weighed against the rent and loses. And I found debate the way certain poor kids find the one thing that turns out to be a door, by accident, at a public school with one underfunded team, and the moment I stood up and made my first argument, I understood that I had walked into the one room where the rules were different. Everywhere else in my life, the outcome was decided before I opened my mouth by money, by connections, by which family you came from, and which neighborhood, and which schools. But in debate, none of that could reach the ballot. I could stand across from a kid whose parents had spent more on his debate coaching than my mother made in a year, and I could take him apart with nothing but a better argument, and the judge would have to vote for me because the argument was better, and that was the only thing the rules let count. Do you understand what that is to a powerless child? It was the first taste of power I ever had. Real power, the power to walk into a room rigged against you and win anyway, on the one thing they couldn't rig. I was drunk on it. I would have done anything to get more of it, to make it the shape of my whole life, to be a person whose voice was a weapon in rooms that mattered. Remember the wanting. The wanting to get out, to have a voice that counted, is the lever the whole thing turns on. I want to be specific about the poverty because the soft version of a story like mine sands it down into a charming little hardship, and the real thing has edges. I knew, by the time I was 10, the exact arithmetic of a household where every single one is weighed against the rent and loses, knew which bills got paid in which order, knew the particular silence of a mother who's deciding which thing to go without this month, knew the shame of the free lunch line and the secondhand everything and the field trips you said you didn't want to go on because it was easier than explaining you couldn't. And I knew the thing that poverty teaches you earliest and deepest, the lesson under all the other lessons, that you do not get to decide. That the powerful decide, and you live inside their decisions, and your job is to be agreeable and grateful and small, because making trouble is a luxury for people with a cushion, and we had no cushion. Every poor kid learns it. Most of us never unlearn it. It's why the powerful can ask us to lose on purpose and expect a yes, because they've spent our whole lives teaching us that losing on cue is just what we do. And then there was the one secondhand thing I wore with pride instead of shame, the suit. A debater wears a suit, and mine came off a thrift store rack, a size not quite right, a little worn at the cuffs, and I stood in it in rooms full of boys whose suits had been cut to fit them by people whose names were stitched inside, and at first I burned about it, the way you burn about everything when you're poor and young. And then I learned the secret that changed my whole life, that the moment I stood up to argue, the suit stopped mattering. The judge didn't write the ballot on the suit. The judge wrote it on the argument. And there was a savage joy in that, in standing there in my wrong-sized thrift store suit and taking apart a boy in a tailored one, because it was proof, public, undeniable on the record, that the thing they'd taught me my whole life was a lie, that I did get to decide, here, in this one room, with this one weapon. The suit was the whole of it, really. The whole class war of my childhood, fought and won, one round at a time, in a jacket that didn't quite fit. The argument was the heart of it, and not the prepared speech, but the rebuttal, the live one, the thing that separates a reciter from a debater. The moment your opponent finishes and you stand up with no script, holding the wreckage of everything they just said, and you answer it, point by point, turning their own logic against them, finding the crack they didn't know was there, and driving the whole case through it until it collapses. That's the thing I lived for. That's where I was most alive, most myself, most powerful, on my feet, in the clash, the unanswerable answer assembling itself in my mind faster than I could speak it, the case dismantling under my voice in real time. Remember the rebuttal. Remember standing up to answer. Remember the voice as a weapon. They're where this whole thing is argued, and they're what I gave away, and they're what I came back to take. And then there was Mr. Sterling, and I learned that the people who lift you up sometimes do it the way you'd raise a thing you intend, eventually, to spend. Richard Sterling was a powerful man, and I need you to understand the particular shape of this betrayal, because it's not the betrayal of a parent or a partner or a coach, it's the betrayal of a patron, which has its own special poison. Sterling was a legend, a former champion debater himself, now a wealthy and connected attorney, a major donor to the whole circuit, a man who could open any door in that world or close it. He had built a reputation as a finder of talent, a lifter up of promising kids, and when he saw me debate, the poor girl from the public school taking apart the private school favorites, he took an interest. He took me under his wing. He mentored me, funded my travel to the tournaments I couldn't afford, made introductions, talked to me about my future, told me I was the most gifted debater he'd seen in 20 years, told me he was going to make sure I got everything my talent deserved. And I, a fatherless poor girl who had never once had a powerful adult in her corner, loved him for it, trusted him, let myself believe I'd been chosen, that I had finally found a champion. That trust, that gratitude, that desperate poor kid hope that someone powerful finally saw me and would lift me out, it was the foundation everything stood on, and it was the exact thing he used to gut me. Because Sterling had a son, and the son's name was Preston, and Preston is the hinge the whole thing turns on, so let me tell you what he was. Preston was a good debater. Genuinely good. Well-coached, well-funded, polished. The product of every advantage money can buy a kid in that world. But Preston was not me, and anyone who could read around knew it, because all the coaching and the camps and the private tutors in the world can buy you polish, but they cannot buy you the thing I had, the live electric gift for the rebuttal, the lock-picking mind. What Preston had that I didn't was Sterling, was a father with the money and the power and the will to arrange the world around his son. And I want to be fair to Preston, because he wasn't cruel, and he wasn't even exactly in on it. Preston was a decent kid who had simply never once in his life had to notice that the world bent itself around him, who assumed he'd win the way a fish assumes water, not out of arrogance, but out of a privilege so total he'd never had occasion to examine it. Remember Preston. He's not the villain. He's the boy the villain arranged the whole world for, who never had to find out, until it was too late and public, what he was actually worth without his father's hand on the scale. There was a fourth person who saw me clearly, the way Sterling pretended to and didn't. Ms. Rourke. She was my debate coach, my real coach, the one at my underfunded public school team, a tough working-class woman who'd come up the same hard way I had, who had no money and no connections and no patience whatsoever for the privileged games of the circuit, and who had seen the gift in me and sharpened it with nothing but her own time and belief. Remember Ms. Rourke. She was the anti-Sterling, and she saved my second life. And remember Tarek, my teammate and my friend, another scholarship kid, another outsider in that gilded world, who had my back when no one with money did, and whom I lost in my first life and came back for in my second. Now I have to tell you about the national team, because it's the center of everything. There was a national selection, the process that chose the small handful of debaters who'd make the national team, the ones who'd compete on the biggest stages, the ones the top colleges recruited, the ones for whom that selection meant full scholarships, the elite pipeline, the launch into the world of law and power and money. For most of the kids in that gilded circuit, making the team was a wonderful achievement on top of an already comfortable life. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the door out, the only door. For a poor girl with a powerful voice and no other way up, the national team meant scholarships I could never otherwise dream of, the colleges that would change the whole arc of my life, the way out of the poverty that had defined every day I'd ever lived. It was my voice, finally, cashed into a future. And that year, the selection came down in the final to the two of us, me and Preston. The poor girl whose voice was her only weapon, and the patron son. And it would be decided the one way that, in theory, money couldn't touch, by a panel of judges, in a live round, on the strength of who argued better. The one arena where I could beat his whole world with nothing but my voice. The night before the final in my first life, Mr. Sterling asked me to his study for the conversation he'd been building toward. He poured himself a drink and sat me down and used the warm voice, the mentor's voice, the voice of the man who'd lifted me up, and he said, "Simone, I want to talk to you about tomorrow, and I want you to hear me out as someone who has only ever had your best interests at heart." And my heart, the foolish, grateful heart of a poor girl who'd been chosen, opened toward him. It's about Preston. You know how much this means to him, to me, to our family. The national team, the colleges that follow, the path it sets, it's his future. And I'll be honest with you, the way I've always been honest with you. You're more talented than he is. I've known it since the day I saw you. But here's the thing about talent like yours. It'll find a way no matter what. You're going to be fine. You're going to be extraordinary. Whatever happens tomorrow, I will personally make sure you land somewhere wonderful. Preston doesn't have that. He has this one chance, and he has me, and that's all. So here's what I'm asking, and I'm asking it as the man who's done more for you than anyone in your life. And here he did the thing, the soft pivot, the gratitude and the power turned into a single blade. Lose tomorrow. Throw the final. Make it look like a real round and let Preston win, and let him make the team. Do this for me, after everything I've done for you, and I promise you, I will take care of you. I'll make sure you're looked after. You have my word. And then the ask, the one that is the title of my whole story, delivered with the absolute certainty of a powerful man who has dressed his own blood loyalty up as my opportunity. Lose the debate final so my son makes the national team. Your talent will find a way no matter what. I want you to hear that lie because it's the whole murder weapon, and it's the particular lie the powerful tell the poor to get them to give up the one thing that would have actually saved them. Talent does not find a way no matter what. Talent without a door dies in a small room of a treatable disease at 45. The door was the national team, and the national team was that final, and there was no other one, not for me, not for a girl with no money and no sterling of her own. And the deeper lie was the one folded inside, I will take care of you, because it was the lie of every patron to every project, the promise that buys your surrender and is never, ever paid out, because the moment I threw that round, I would stop being useful to him, and a man like Sterling does not take care of what is no longer useful. And the cruelest thing, the thing I'd understand fully only when I was grown and dead and reborn, was the word son. I'd thought I was almost his. I'd thought being chosen, being lifted, being told I was the most gifted he'd seen in 20 years, meant I was something to him. And the moment his actual blood was on the line, I learned exactly what I was: a project, a talented poor girl he'd enjoyed discovering, expendable the instant his son needed her gone. He had a son, and I was not it, and the lifting up had only ever been on loan. And he'd found the one lever a poor chosen child has no defense against: the gratitude, the hope, the desperate belief that the powerful man who'd lifted her would keep his word, and behind it the raw fact of his power over her entire future, and he used both to ask me to sit down and be silent in the one fight that would have set me free. And I did it. God forgive the girl I was, but understand her, I did it. The next day at the final, in front of the panel and the room, I threw it. I stood up to debate the boy I could have demolished in my sleep, and I lost on purpose. I pulled my punches, let his weak points stand when I should have driven through them, gave soft answers where I had devastating ones, conceded ground I'd never have conceded, let my own case go slack and unanswered. And the worst part, the part that followed me into 30 years of gray, powerless silence, is that the room knew. A real judge knows the smell of a thrown round, the wrongness of a strong debater who keeps not landing the blow, and I could feel Ms. Rourke's eyes on me from the back of the room, feel her watching her best debater sit down inside her own argument. And I did it anyway, because I decided gratitude required it, because the powerful man had promised to take care of me, because a poor girl who's finally been chosen will set herself on fire to keep the warmth. And Preston, debating against a version of me that had taken herself out of the fight, won the round and made the national team, and Sterling shook his son's hand with a pride he had never once shown me, and I, the best debater in that room, in that circuit, maybe in that whole generation, got nothing, and the door closed, and it did not open again. And Sterling did not take care of me. Of course he didn't. That's the part that finished me. Within weeks the warmth was gone, the introductions dried up, the calls stopped being returned, because I'd served my purpose, the round was thrown, Preston was placed, and a project that has done its job is just a poor girl again, and poor girls are not a thing a man like Sterling spends his time on. The promise had been a lie, the way they always are, the precise price of my surrender, never meant to be paid. And the door I'd thrown, the national team, the scholarships, the colleges, the way out, closed for good, and there was no other, and I went back to being exactly what I'd been before debate gave me a glimpse of power, a poor girl with a powerful voice that no room would ever let her use. There was no other door, and the loss did not stay contained to one round. Without the national team, without the scholarships, the colleges that would have changed everything stayed shut, and I couldn't afford the ones that didn't, and the brilliant arguer who should have gone to law school and stood in real courtrooms went instead into the grinding low-wage powerlessness that had been waiting for me all along, a series of jobs where I had no voice and no say, where my only role was to do what I was told, where the gift for argument that could have moved juries was wasted reading scripts to angry strangers on a phone. Let me stay in that ruin a moment, because the way it spread is the part nobody warns you about, the part that's worse than one lost round. I had learned the lesson Sterling taught me, the one poverty had already half taught me, and he finished, that the powerful decide, that the powerless lose on cue to keep their favor, that the way to survive is to sit down and swallow the argument. And once you've thrown the one round that mattered, you throw all of them. You stop raising your hand. You stop making the case for the raise, the promotion, the better apartment, the doctor, because you've internalized all the way down that your argument doesn't count, that making it only marks you as trouble, that the agreeable silent ones are the ones who get to keep what little they have. I became, over the gray decades, exactly the woman the world wanted a poor woman to be: quiet, compliant, voiceless, taking up no space, making no case, accepting every decision made about me by people with more power, because I'd been taught early by poverty and taught finally by Sterling, that this was simply what someone like me was for. The voice that had once swept rooms went so unused that I half forgot I'd ever had it. The most dangerous arguer of her generation spent 30 years saying yes, of course, whatever you think is best to people who weren't half as smart, because they had the power and she had been trained out of using the one thing that could have matched it. And then I opened my eyes, and the case notes were real on the desk in front of me in my own 17-year-old handwriting, and my mind was alive and arguing the way it hadn't in 30 gray years. And it was the morning of the final. I did not cry, and I'll be straight with you about that because the soft version has me weeping over my case notes, and the real version is sharper and harder. What moved through me, sitting there with the brief in front of me in my own young hand, was the clean, total clarity of a debater who has thrown the one round that mattered, sat down inside her own argument for a powerful man's promise, and just been handed, against every law of time and logic, the chance to stand up and argue it for real. The strangeness of it nearly undid me, that first hour, because nobody tells you what it is to be your grown self and your young self at the same time, in the same body. The morning of the day it all went wrong. I looked at my hands, and they were a 17-year-old's hands. I looked at the brief, and it was in my own young handwriting, the case I'd built and then betrayed, every argument I'd prepared and then swallowed laid out in front of me, untouched, unthrown, still possible. I could hear my mother somewhere in the small apartment, alive again, getting ready for the work that would wear her down, and the sound of her went through me like a blade, because I knew the whole future, knew the thrown round and the broken promise and the gray decades and the back room and the unmade argument, knew all of it, carried all of it, in a body that hadn't lived any of it yet. For that hour I half expected, every time I blinked, to wake back in the small room with the warnings my body had been sending up and no money to answer them. But the brief was real under my hands, and the rebuttals were assembling themselves in my mind the way they used to, and slowly the strangeness settled into the one hard certainty underneath, that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, the morning of the final, and that I was not going to spend it dazed. I had a round to argue. More than that, I had a voice to take back out of the silence I'd buried it in, and a door to walk through that I'd let a powerful man close, and one chance to stand up where I'd sat down. And underneath the clarity, lower down, was something close to fury, the good kind, the kind that wins rounds, because I could feel the voice again, the weapon, the live electric thing. I read the brief, and the rebuttals assembled themselves in my mind the way they used to, fast and clean and devastating, the lock-picking gift flooding back after 30 years of silence, and I nearly stood up right there at the desk, because I'd spent a whole gray life voiceless and powerless, and now I was 17, and the argument was alive in me again, the one weapon I'd ever had, sharp and ready. Even if the door had been gone forever, I think I'd have wept just to feel the voice again, to be back in the one room where being poor wasn't a sentence, where my argument cut through money like it wasn't there. The revenge, whatever it became, was always going to run second to that. The first thing was that I had my voice back. Everything else came from refusing, this time, to sit down. The morning before the final was strange and vivid, and the strangest part was all of them being alive and unwritten again. Sterling, warm and powerful and not yet exposed. Preston, polished and oblivious and not yet undone. Ms. Rourke, somewhere prepping the team, not yet watching me throw it. Tarek, who'd had my back, whom I'd lost in another life. I moved through that morning like a debater going back over a lost round, finding every place the first one had gone wrong. I went to Ms. Rourke first. Not strategy, something closer to settling a debt. In my first life, after I threw the final, Ms. Rourke had known. A coach that good, who'd built me from nothing, would have seen exactly what I did, would have watched her best debater pull every punch and concede every point and sit down inside a winning case, and she'd have known I was throwing it, and something in her had gone cold and grieved and, worse, betrayed, because she'd poured herself into a poor kid on the belief that the kid would never do the one thing the privileged world wanted from us, which was to lose on cue. So in my second life, I found her, and I said plain, whatever happens today, whatever anyone's asked me to do, I'm arguing my best. Every point, every rebuttal, all the way. If I make the team, I make it on the ballots. She looked at me with those hard, knowing eyes, the eyes of a woman who'd come up the same way I had and out-argued every doubter, and she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "Good. Because I'll tell you the only thing I've ever known for certain in this game, the thing they tried to teach me out of and couldn't. There's no luck in a real round and no money that touches a real ballot, not when the argument is clean enough. They'll try to buy it 100 ways, and the one thing they can't buy is an argument so true the judge can't vote against it. So stand up today and make it that true. Make it so true they can't touch it. The better argument doesn't care whose son you are. That's the only weapon we ever get, and it's enough if you'll actually use it." She didn't know she was describing the exact shape of my death and my resurrection. I never told her, but I've carried it into every argument I've made since. The better argument doesn't care whose son you are, make it that true, and they can't touch it. I did not confront Sterling that morning, and people always ask why I didn't expose him the moment I woke up knowing what he was. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because a confrontation was a scene, and a scene was a thing Sterling could win easily, the way the powerful always win scenes against the poor. He was the legend, the donor, the man everyone in that world owed, fluent in the language of the generous mentor disappointed in an ungrateful girl, and any accusation I made would be turned, instantly, into proof that the scholarship kid had gotten above herself, gotten greedy, bitten the hand, and the whole circuit would believe him, because believing him cost them nothing, and believing me cost them their comfort. The one move he had no answer to was a debater who simply, quietly, was no longer available to throw the round. So I gave him nothing to push against. I was warm. I was his grateful project, and inside I was a sealed brief he couldn't read, and I let him walk toward the final, certain that the girl he was counting on to lose had quietly, permanently, decided to argue. And I watched Preston because Preston was the arranged-for boy at the center of it, and I needed to see him clear with my second life eyes. And here's what I saw, the thing my gratitude and my hurt had blurred the first time. Preston had no idea.
None.
He thought he was walking into a final to do his best against a worthy opponent, the way you do, and it would never have crossed his mind that his father had gone behind the scenes and arranged for that opponent to throw it, because in Preston's world, things simply worked out for him, and he never had cause to wonder why, never had to notice the invisible hand that had smoothed every path he'd ever walked. He wasn't cruel. He was, in his polished way, almost kind to me. He was just a boy who had never once been made to find out what he was worth on a level field, because his father had made certain the field was never level. Remember that. It's why his loss wasn't just a loss. It was the first true thing that ever happened to him, the first crack in a lifetime of the world arranging itself around him, and a boy can survive that, even be saved by it, the way I'd never been allowed to be saved by anything. Preston was never the villain. Preston was the son the villain arranged the whole world for, used as the reason to sit a poor girl down and silence her. And there was Tarek. I have to tell you about Tarek because in my first life I lost him along with everything else, and some of what I came back for was him. Tarek was my teammate, another scholarship kid, another outsider in that gilded world. A sharp, funny, fiercely loyal boy who wore his own slightly wrong suit and had his own savage joy in beating the tailored ones, and who was the one person in that whole circuit who had my back without wanting anything for it. In my first life, after I threw the final, I'd pulled away from Tarek the way you pull away from everyone when you've done a thing you're ashamed of, because a friend is someone who sees you, and I couldn't bear to be seen, and I'd lost him, and the loss had been one more quiet casualty of that thrown round. So in my second life, I found him that morning before the final, and he did the thing he always did, bumped my shoulder and said, "You're gonna wreck him, right? Tell me you're gonna wreck him. I want to watch a Sterling lose to a kid in a $40 suit. It's the only thing I've ever wanted." And in my first life, I'd given him some soft, deflecting non-answer, already half decided to throw it. This time I looked at him and said, "I'm gonna wreck him." And Tarek grinned the grin of an outsider who's about to watch the rigged world lose for once, and said, "Good. Because everybody in this circuit knows it's you, Simone. They know. The only person who's gonna pretend otherwise is the guy whose name is on the building." Out of the mouth of a fellow outsider, the whole truth, plainly. I kept Tarek this time. He was at my side, still loyal, still in a slightly wrong suit on principle, for the rest of a life that actually had people in it. The day of the final, Sterling found me one last time, exactly as I knew he would, with the ask he'd built toward. He caught me in the hall before the round, and he put his hand on my shoulder, warm and heavy, the hand of the powerful man who'd lifted me, and he said low, "Remember our conversation, Simone. Remember everything I've done for you. Everything I'm going to do. Today's the day. Lose for Preston, and I'll take care of you. You have my word." I looked at him, this man whose promise I'd been ready to die for, and I felt the weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, level and clear as a closing argument, "No, Mr. Sterling. I'm arguing my best today. Every point, all the way. If Preston can beat me on the ballots, the team's his and I'll shake his hand and mean it. But I'm not sitting down inside my own case so that he doesn't have to be as good as me to win." The silence that came back at me was a thing I'll remember as long as I have a voice. He'd never heard it from me. Not from his grateful project, not without a seam he could widen into the old yes. And when he spoke again, the warmth was gone, and what was underneath was cold and absolute, the voice of power that has never been told no by someone it owns. "After everything I've done for you, do you have any idea how easy it would be for me to make sure you never get anywhere in this world? I lifted you out of nothing. I can put you right back. Don't be stupid, and don't be ungrateful. Sit down tomorrow, do as you're told, or find out exactly how much your talent is worth without me." And there it was, at last, the thing under the warmth all along. Not a mentor at all, but a man who'd bought a poor girl's gratitude as cheaply as he could, and now expected the surrender he'd paid for, and who, the instant I balked, reached for the only thing he'd ever really offered, which was the threat. In my first life, that threat, "I can put you right back," would have unmade me, because a poor girl knows exactly how real the powerful man's power is. But I wasn't only that girl anymore. I'd already been put right back. I died in the back room he was threatening me with, of the poverty he was promising me. So I said, level and unafraid, "Then put me back. But I'm not throwing it. If Preston's good enough to make the team, he'll do it against my best argument. If he can only do it against my silence, then he was never good enough, and you know it, and that's the whole reason you're standing in this hallway threatening a 17-year-old. The better argument doesn't care whose son you are, Mr. Sterling. And mine is better." And I walked past him into the room, and I stood up and I argued. Here's the part Sterling never understood, the mechanism under the whole thing, and I'll lay it out plain because it's the engine of everything. The final was decided by a panel of judges on the strength of the round. 5 judges, 5 ballots, and the better debater wins them. In my first life, by throwing it, I didn't do anything to Preston. I simply removed the best argument from the room. I, who'd have swept the panel, pulled my punches and conceded my ground and sat down inside a winning case, and with my real argument gone, Preston's polished, well-funded, perfectly adequate case became the best thing in the room, and the judges voted for it. Not because he'd out-argued me, but because I'd taken my argument off the table. My surrender was the entire margin. The day I argued my best, the margin came back. I stood up and made the case the way I was built to make it, drove through every weak point I'd let stand the first time, answered every argument I'd conceded, and the round wasn't close, because it was never going to be close once I actually showed up, and when the 5 judges turned in their ballots, Preston had lost all 5. 5-0. A clean sweep, every single judge, in a circuit that bent toward the wealthy boy, voting for the poor girl, because the argument was so undeniably better that even a panel inclined towards Sterling's son could not, in conscience, hand him a ballot. He didn't lose 5-0 because I did anything to him. He lost 5-0 because I stopped doing something for him. I stopped silencing the one argument that could beat his so that his would look like enough. I'll tell you about the final because in my first life I threw it, and arguing it for real in my second was a resurrection on my feet, in front of the room, with the one weapon I ever had. The round was the round, the resolution, the constructive speeches, the cross-examination, the rebuttals, the panel of 5 at the back of the room with their ballots. And when I stood up to argue, the thing happened that always happened when I truly debated, the thing I'd starved for across 30 silent years. The room sharpened and narrowed, and the whole world became the clash, and I came alive. There's a feeling at the top of a round that I'd forgotten across 30 years of saying whatever you think is best. The moment you rise, and the timer starts, and everything else in the world falls away, the suit and the money and the names on the buildings, until there's only the resolution and your voice and the clean architecture of the case you're about to build. I made my constructive clean and tight, every contention load-bearing, every link in the chain tested, nothing left soft, and I could feel the room lean in because a real argument has a sound to it, a structural soundness you can hear, and mine was built to carry weight. And then I sat through Preston's, and here is where the gift lives. I listened to his polished, well-coached, perfectly fine argument, and I heard, the way I always heard, every crack in it. The contention that sounded strong but rested on an assumption he'd never been made to examine. The link that didn't quite connect if you pressed it. The place where his privilege had let him skip the hard step because no coach who depended on his father's money had ever made him take it. In cross-examination, I didn't pounce. I just asked the quiet questions, the ones that look harmless and aren't, the ones that walk a debater out onto the thin ice of his own logic and leave him there, and I watched Preston answer them the way a boy answers who has never had to defend a position against someone who actually wanted it to fall, and I saw the panel see it too. And then I stood up for the rebuttal, with no script, holding the wreckage of everything he'd said, and I answered it, point by point, turning his own logic against him, finding the crack he didn't know was there, and driving the whole case through it until it came apart on the floor between us. It was not cruel, and it was not loud. It was just true and so clean that there was nothing he could say back, because you cannot outfund the truth and you cannot outconnect a better argument, and for once, in the one room where it counted, the truth and the better argument were mine. I took each of his contentions in turn and showed where it failed, and then, this is the thing that wins rounds, the thing the gift is for, I showed how the failures connected, how the whole case had the same flaw running through it, the flaw of a position that had never been stress-tested because no one had ever dared, and I named it cleanly and let it sit. I watched the judges' faces do the thing judges' faces do when a round stops being a contest and becomes a demonstration. That slight stillness, that putting down of the pen, that look of people who came to score a debate and are instead watching someone do the thing the whole activity exists to honor. And I knew, the way you know a round is won before the ballots come back, that I'd swept it. And at the back of the room, Ms. Rourke, who in another life had watched me sit down inside my own case and grieved, caught my eye and gave a single hard nod, and I knew what was in it, because I'd waited a lifetime to earn it. That in another life I'd thrown this, and in this one I'd stood up and argued it true. And the ballots came back, and it was 5-0, and Preston had not won a single one. And then Mr. Sterling broke. It happened as the decision was announced, as the sweep became undeniable, as the room understood that the patron's son had been beaten not just cleanly but unanimously, swept by the poor girl on every ballot. And I watched the realization move across Sterling's face in stages. First the disbelief, the certainty there'd been a mistake, that surely Preston had won, that the arrangement had held. Then the dawning horror as the count sank in, not 3-2, not a close one that could be explained away, but 5-0, a verdict so total that no story could be told over it, no money could touch it, no power could unring it. Then, slowly, the understanding that there was nothing to be done, that a panel's unanimous ballot cannot be bought back or appealed, that his son had just been revealed, in front of the whole circuit, as the second-best debater in a two-person round, and that the national team spot was going to the poor girl he'd tried to silence. And then his face did the thing I'd waited 2 lifetimes to see. It cracked, the warmth and the power and the legend all falling away, because he'd just understood that Preston's victory had never existed except in the space my surrender made, and the one time I refused, his son lost every single ballot. He made a sound, not loud, the small, stunned, terrible sound of a powerful man discovering that there was, after all, one room his money couldn't buy, and one weapon his power couldn't beat, and that the poor girl he'd thought he owned had just used it to take everything back. I knew that face, though I'd never worn it myself. I'd worn its slow inside-out version. Across 30 gray years, the long, quiet collapse of a person living inside a decision they can't undo. Sterling was having that whole collapse in one public minute. He had staked everything on a single bet, that the poor girl he'd lifted would stay grateful and dependent and obedient, would lose on cue the way the powerful had spent her whole life training her to, would hand over her one door because she believed she owed him for the key, and the bet had just failed, unanimously, in front of the entire circuit he ruled, and there was nothing underneath it. No real victory for Preston. No real superiority. No ground to stand on. Only the exposed fact of a powerful man who'd tried to spend a gifted poor girl on his own son and been caught doing it in the most public, most unappealable way the activity allowed. 5 judges, 5 ballots, 0 for the boy he'd arranged the world around. And the circuit saw it. That was the part he could never undo. They'd all watched the legend's son take the spot the year before. Now they watched him lose every ballot to the girl that legend had stopped funding, and a circuit does its own quiet arithmetic about a man like that, and the answer is not the kind that keeps your name on a building forever. The legend of Richard Sterling, finder and lifter of talent, took its first real crack in that room, and it was the crack of a panel saying, 5-0, that the talent had been real and he'd tried to bury it. I did not go to him. I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't cross the room and explain that Preston had lost 5-0 by the exact measure of the argument I'd refused, this time, to swallow. I stood there with the ballots in my favor and Ms. Rourke's nod still warm in my chest, and I let Sterling break, because his breaking was not a case I had to argue. The only thing I'd done was stand up and make my best argument and decline for one round, to silence it so his son wouldn't have to be as good as me. The rest he'd done himself, the night he sat a poor girl down in his study and dressed his own blood loyalty up as her opportunity. And then something happened that told me everything about what Sterling had made. Preston came to me. Not gracious exactly, not at first. He came over with the dazed look of a boy whose world had just done something it had never done before, which was to not arrange itself for him, and he said, half to himself, I've never lost like that. 5-0. I didn't even. And he stopped, and I watched him do a kind of arithmetic he'd never had to do, watched something flicker behind his eyes, the first crack of an awareness that the winds had maybe never been quite what he'd thought, that the field had maybe never been level, that he'd been carried his whole life by a hand he'd never noticed because it had never once let go. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just a boy meeting the truth for the first time, and it's a hard thing to meet at 17, and harder still to suspect that someone you love arranged for you to never meet it sooner. You were just better, he said finally, and there was something almost like relief in it, the relief of a person who's spent his life uneasy about a thing he couldn't name finally hearing it named. He went on, I heard later, to become a more honest competitor and, I suspect, a better man, once the world stopped lying to him about who he was. The boy Sterling held up as the reason to silence me turned out to be another person Sterling had failed, just more comfortably than he'd failed me. Preston was never the villain. He was just the son used. Mr. Sterling came to find me a few days later, not to apologize because Sterling didn't have that in him, but lost and cold and genuinely uncomprehending, and his not understanding showed me the exact shape of the thing that had ruined us both. So I told him, not the rebirth, not the back room, not the unmade argument, the mechanism. I said, you found a poor girl with a voice and you lifted her up, and you let her believe she'd been chosen, that she was almost yours, and the first time your real son needed her gone, you asked her to sit down and be silent and lose on purpose, and you called it her opportunity, and you promised to take care of her, and you never meant a word of it. But Preston was never good enough to beat me. The only reason he ever won was that I threw it. My silence was the whole margin. The one time I argued my best, he lost every ballot, 5-0, because that's exactly how far short of me he always was, and you knew it. You told me yourself I was more talented the night you asked me to lose. I let that sit. There was no other door for me. You knew that too. You're the one who controls the doors. You looked at the best debater you'd seen in 20 years and decided she should sit down and stay poor so your son could have a future, and you dressed it up as taking care of her, and then you didn't even do that. So this time I stood up. That's not me beating Preston. I never touched his case. I just stopped silencing mine. And it turns out the better argument doesn't care whose son you are. You can buy the camps and the coaches and the polish and the connections, but you cannot buy a ballot when the argument on the other side is true enough, and mine was. The one time I refused to lose on purpose, the panel told the truth, and the truth was 5-0. He didn't have an answer. There was nothing to argue. He looked at me like he was seeing, for the first time, the thing he'd spent so much energy not seeing, that the poor girl he'd lifted and discarded had a weapon his money couldn't match and his power couldn't take, and that he'd just been beaten with it in front of the whole world he ruled. And I think some cold part of him understood that he hadn't lost control of me at the final. He'd been losing it from a moment. He decided my voice was a thing to be spent on his son rather than a gift to be lifted on its own terms, and the final was just the day the ballot said it out loud. He left without another word. I never threw around for him again. And that, more than the team, more than the 5-0, was the moment Mr. Sterling truly broke, not in the room, where it was public, but quietly, where he finally saw. I made the team. I want you to sit in those words, because in my first life they were the great unbearable if I carried into a gray powerless life and a death of poverty, if only I'd argued it, and in my second they were simply what I did. I made the national team, and the scholarships came, and the colleges came, and the door out, the only door, the one I'd thrown, open at last, because the only thing that had ever stood between me and a life with a voice was a powerful man who taught me that gratitude meant silence, and the moment I stopped believing him, the door I'd had no other way through swung open because the argument had always been on my side. The years after were the years I should have had, and I want to tell you about the thing that meant the most because it's a kind of victory I could only have imagined from the bottom. I went to law school. Of course I did. Debate is just the rehearsal, and I had finally been let into the real thing. And I became a lawyer, but not the kind Sterling was, not the kind who lends his voice to power for money. I became an advocate for the people who have no voice at all, the poor, the powerless, the ones the system is built to grind down quietly, the ones who die in back rooms of treatable things because no one will hear their argument. The girl who died unheard became a voice for the unheard. I stood up in real courtrooms, with the same gift that had swept that panel 5-0, and I made the case for people who could never have made it for themselves, and I won, again and again, because the better argument doesn't care how much money is in the room, and I had spent my whole life learning to make it that true. Every case I argued a little for the woman in the back room with the unmade argument, the one I'd been in another life, dying with the best case of her life and no one to hear it. This time someone heard it. This time the someone was me. And there was a day, years in, that was the truest measure of how far the two roads had run apart. I found myself, as a lawyer, on the other side of a case from Sterling's world. Not him exactly, but his kind, the moneyed power he represented, the side that always wins because it can afford to, arrayed against a client of mine who had nothing but the truth and my voice. And I stood up in that courtroom. The poor girl Sterling had tried to silence, now an advocate with a record, and I argued, and I won. Beat the money with a better argument, in a real room where the stakes were a real person's real life, not a debate trophy. It was the thing debate had always promised and the world had always denied, that a true enough argument could beat power, in a room that mattered, for keeps. Sterling had taught me, by trying to prove the opposite, exactly how to do it. And I did it for the rest of my life for everyone who came to me with nothing but a case and no one to make it to. And there was one more thing, the quietest. I never forgot what it is to be the gifted poor kid in a gilded room, lifted up by a powerful hand that intends, eventually, to spend you. So I found those kids, the scholarship debaters, the public school ones, the ones with the voice and no Sterling of their own, and I became for them the thing I'd needed and didn't have, a person in their corner who wanted nothing back, who lifted them with no strings, who told them the truth Sterling never told me, that their voice was theirs, that they should never sit down in a winning case for anyone's promise, that the better argument doesn't care whose son you are, and neither, ever, should they. Some of what I came back for was them, the next poor kid with a powerful voice, told this time to stand up and use it. I saw Mr. Sterling one last time, years later, and it's the truest measure of the distance between the two lives. I was an established advocate by then, a name in my own right, a lawyer whose record spoke for itself, at some legal gathering, and Sterling was old, diminished, a former power whose son had never quite become anything, and whose own legend had faded the way legends do when the talent they take credit for turns out to have been borrowed. He saw me, saw the lawyer I'd become, the record, the standing, the unmistakable fact that the poor girl he'd tried to silence and discard had built a voice that mattered in rooms far more real than his, and the old, complicated recognition crossed his face. He came over. He said my name, just my name, Simone, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old thing, the gratitude, the hope, the desperate poor kid wanting of his approval that had run my first whole life. And it wasn't there. Where it had been was a clean, quiet space, because the wanting had finally, fully died, not in bitterness, but in completion, the way a hunger dies when you've fed yourself, at last, from your own table. There was a whole life out there with my name on it, cases I hadn't won yet, people in back rooms who needed a voice, and I was so completely full of my own hard-won power that there was nothing left in me to want from the man who'd once held all the power I'd ever dreamed of. He tried to talk. He said something about how he'd always known I was the most gifted he'd ever seen, how the circuit was complicated, how a father has to look out for his own, how he hoped I understood the position he'd been in. It was the closest Sterling could come to an apology, and it still managed to be about him. And I noticed, listening, that I didn't need it, not the apology, not the admission, not anymore anything he had to give, because he no longer had anything I wanted. In my first life, I'd have given everything for this man to say he was proud of me, to take back the thread in the hallway, to finally choose me. I'd have built a whole reconciliation on the scrap and been grateful. But I'd had my peace years before. The day the ballots came back 5-0, and every day since in every real courtroom where my voice did the thing he'd try to take from me. I didn't need Sterling to lift me. I'd lifted myself, and a great many others besides. So I let him finish, and I didn't argue, and I didn't accept it either. I just let it land in the air between us, and dissolve. I had a wonderful coach once, I said, and let the pause sit before I finished, a woman named Rourke. She taught me the better argument doesn't care whose son you are. And I gave him a small, distant, final nod, not the grateful, eager look of the girl who'd have thrown anything for a powerful man's promise. That girl was at rest now, free at last, gone with the back room and the unmade argument of a life that no longer counts. And then I went back to my own life, my own voice, my own people who'd never once asked me to be silent, and I left Sterling holding the memory of a girl he'd told to lose, who had instead become a voice he could never afford. I think about that final, sometimes. The study, the warm voice, the heavy hand on my shoulder, the line, lose the debate final so my son makes the national team. Do this for me after everything I've done for you, and I'll take care of you. And how in one life I obeyed and sat down inside my own argument for a promise that was never going to be kept and died poor and voiceless and unheard. And in another life I refused and stood up and argued it true. The whole divergence of two lives, the difference between dying of poverty in a back room and standing in real courtrooms with a voice that mattered, came down to a single word, the day of the final. No. The smallest word and the truest argument I ever made. I've lived both answers now, the obedient yes and the steady no, and I can tell you exactly what each one costs and what each one buys. The yes costs you everything and feels in the moment, like grace, like loyalty, like gratitude, like being a good person who knows her place and makes room. And the no costs you a powerful man's favor and a promise that was never real, and feels, in the moment, like ingratitude and danger and biting the hand, and buys you your entire life. That's the trap, the whole machinery of it. They've arranged the world so that the choice that saves you feels like a sin, and the choice that destroys you feels like a virtue. And the only way out is to have died once already inside the yes, to know in your bones that the promise is a lie and the gratitude is a leash, and to say the no anyway, level and unafraid, and stand up and make your case. I had to lose a whole life to learn it. I'm telling you, so maybe you won't have to. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the dark after my first death, the confrontations, the exposures, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to stand up and argue my best while the powerful man who told me to lose discovered, 5-0, what his son was worth without a poor girl silencing herself to make room. I never raised my voice except to argue. I never did a thing to Preston. I just made my own case and let the panel tell the truth. And it turned out the whole thing, Preston's win, Sterling's promise, all of it, had only ever been standing on my willingness to lose on purpose. And the one time I refused, the truth came out, and the truth was 5-0. I've thought a great deal, across 2 lives, about the particular con Sterling ran on me because it's the con the powerful run on the gifted poor in every field there is, and almost no one names it. It isn't you're not good enough. He couldn't use that one. The ballots would have laughed at it, and we both knew what I was. The con was subtler and far more effective, and it had 2 moving parts. The first was the lift. Find the talented poor kid, lift her up, fund her, flatter her, make her feel chosen, and in doing so, make her grateful, and make her dependent, and make her believe that her rise is your gift rather than her due, so that when the day comes that you need something from her, she'll feel that she owes it. And the second part was the ask, dressed as her opportunity. Your talent will find a way no matter what. You'll be fine. Let my son have this. Do it for me after everything I've done for you. I'll take care of you. It is the most efficient machine ever built for getting a poor person to hand over the one thing that would have saved her, because it never feels like a robbery. It feels like gratitude. It feels like being a good person. It feels like the natural order. The powerful keep their own, and the lifted up stay grateful and make room, and you participate in your own dispossession and call it loyalty. And here is the thing it took me dying to understand. The thing I'd tell every lifted up poor kid if I could. The lift was never a gift. It was an investment, and you were the asset, and the day they ask you to lose on purpose is the day the investment comes due, and the I'll take care of you is the lie that closes the deal because they never, ever take care of what's no longer useful. The gratitude they cultivated in you was the leash all along. The people who lift you up so they can spend you are not your benefactors. They're your owners, running a longer game. The real ones lift you and let go. So no, I don't feel a flicker of guilt that Preston lost 5-0. I did nothing to Preston. I just stopped paying a debt I never actually owed to a man who disguised an investment as a kindness and let myself argue for once, as well as I actually could. Refusing to lose on purpose is not ingratitude to the people who lifted you. It only feels that way to the ones who lifted you in order to cash you in. The people who ask a poor girl to lose on purpose and call it her opportunity are almost always the ones who needed her to lose. I lost a round on purpose once, for a powerful man's promise, and I died poor and voiceless of a thing money would have fixed. I won't lose on purpose again. Not in this life, and if there's another after it, not in that one either. I'm arguing my best most days now. In a life with a voice, the cases coming the way they do when the work is real and the stakes are someone's actual life, and I'm finally where I was built to be. And every time I rise to make a case, every rebuttal, every clean, true argument that beats more money than I'll ever have, I think about the woman who died in a back room with the best argument of her life unmade, the voice she'd given away for a promise, and I'm so grateful she got the chance to do it differently. Because that girl who stood up at the final didn't just win back the national team. She won back the voice, the argument, the rebuttal, the one weapon that cuts through money like it isn't there, and the simple, total, hard-won fact of being the one who stands up and makes her case, instead of the one who sits down and stays silent, so someone with a powerful father can win. And she never, ever, lost a round on purpose again. I died the first time with the best argument of my life unmade, voiceless and powerless in a back room, of a thing money would have fixed. I intend to die the second time an old woman who spent her whole life standing up and making the case, with a record of real rooms won behind her, and a voice that mattered to the end. And if I have to die with an argument in my mind, let it be one I got to make, out loud, in a room that heard it. Same argument, both ends of 2 lives. The first time it was the phantom of everything I gave away, the unanswerable case for my own life, unspoken, in a room where no one hears the poor. This time it's the real thing, everything I kept, made out loud in rooms that counted for myself and for everyone like me who had no voice of their own. And the only thing that ever stood between the two was a single word, the day of the final, said level and clear as a closing argument to the powerful man who told me to lose. No.